Okay, so today we're continuing our talk about animism. I was telling my students I was just kind of in a stream of consciousness flow in last class, so I'll be a little more systematic today. So just to get a running start, let's start back at the beginning. Animism is defined as a belief that virtually everything is alive, has a spirit, like a soul or spirit. And the reason it's qualified with virtually is because there are dead things, and they are dead because the spirit has departed from the physical vehicle that spirit was indwelling, whether that's a rock, a tree, a human, a dog, or a coffee mug. Brought number one back today. He was really enjoying this class. Okay. I want to make sure you guys don't get confused, though, because in the West, we do have a concept called anthropomorphism. Anyone want to take a guess of what that means? Anthropomorphism.
Turning something that's not a human, making it look like one, or giving it human characteristics.
Perfect. Thank you, Josiah. So it's giving non-human things, and that could be a tree, a rock, a river, a dog, human characteristics. That's anthropomorphism. And we see a lot of that, like in Disney, where Old Woman Willow Tree, that was like an anthropomorphic rendition. I mean, yes, the Native Americans believed trees were alive and had their own soul and spirit, but they didn't meld into human features and have a mouth and spoke to you in your native tongue. That's not how trees communicate with humans. Trees communicate in different ways, and I love communicating with trees all the time. I spend a lot of time with trees. In fact, usually my vacations or refreshment times are visiting specific trees that I have met over the years, and I go back and see them year after year, and I just love sitting with them and contemplating on their life and their longevity. And I've learned a lot of really important things from trees. But a tree has never formed a face or a mouth and spoken to me in English. That's not happened. But I do feel we do have some sort of connection when I'm with the tree. And you can say, oh, you're just projecting Blackburn and all that. Well, maybe not. I've learned things from trees like how to be content where God has planted you. The importance of sending down deep roots so you can survive the storms of life. But also the importance of bearing fruit, because a tree that just has roots and no fruit actually becomes a danger to the other trees around them and young saplings. It can actually choke them out in the garden. I've learned that pruning, even though we don't like it, it actually enables us to grow in a better way, a more healthy way, and to bear more fruit. And I've learned all these things from spending time with and hanging out with trees. Get plenty of rest, enjoy the sunshine, and drink lots of water. Those are all wisdom from the trees. And I'm proud to say trees are some of my best friends. Now, there's another term I want you to think about, and we see this in the Bible a lot, and this is called zoomorphism. Anyone want to take a guess on what that word means? Zoomorphism.
Anything into animals?
Yes, so just like anthropomorphism is giving human characteristics to non-human things, zoomorphism is giving animal characteristics to non-animal things. And so, for example, in the scriptures, God is sometimes described as spreading his wings over his people, right? And you also have to take into account in language the use of metaphor and simile, right? Using one thing to represent another. And in scriptures, you have to determine, is this like anthropomorphism, zoomorphism, or just full-blown animism? Or is it simply a literary device where God or the prophets, whoever's writing the particular book, is using metaphor and simile to describe some trait or attribute of God? So, for example, we know through the totality of Scripture that God is spirit, but so he wouldn't have physical attributes. So when we hear things like the face of God or the hand of God or God sheltering us under his wings, I personally take those as metaphor to teach us things about God's provision, his protection, his covering over us. Does that make sense? All right. Now, I do think there are some animistic parts in the Bible. We'll get that towards the end of the lecture. The other thing I wanted to point out, Disney is so good at giving worldviews to children. I mean, I don't know if you like their method or whatnot, but I told you Pocahontas was a really excellent example of an animistic worldview versus like a materialistic worldview. The Europeans were just seeing the new world as means to material wealth. So when they looked at a forest, they didn't see a community of living beings. They saw board feet of lumber, or places where they could clear and plant crops, or wood to build their homes. When they saw animals, they didn't see them as living beings in a community. They saw it as fur, and fur translates into cash or wealth or material things. So very different concept, because the Native Americans, even though they would hunt, even though they would build long houses out of wood, their relationship to trees and animals was very different from the European mindset. And a lot of that came from what I call dominion theology, if you've ever heard of that. And that comes from Genesis, where God creates man in his own image, and he is the highest part of God's terrestrial creation in the Genesis account. And God gave man dominion over the earth. And that's a really strong word in Hebrew. It's like a picture word. It's like having your heel on someone else's neck. That's how strong a word it is. So man has this power and authority and control over creation. And for probably the last 15, well, even longer, 1,800 years or more, that has been kind of the mindset of Christianity, is this dominion sort of, we need to subdue the earth, we need to bring it under our authority control. But now, in the latter part of the 21st century, our wilderness areas are like preserves, right? It's not like the continent of North America is just one unending forest, but it's now like we have to preserve parks and forests and wilderness area to try to keep something pristine, something the way it was, that man hasn't come in and changed or used or abused, for that matter. And this is what I like to call stewardship theology. And the idea is, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. Revelations 4:11 tells us God made all things for his glory. And so even though we get to use and enjoy the works of God's hands, it belongs to him. And so a steward is someone who is put in authority, but they have to give an account to the Lord, the one who actually owns the earth. And that's what I would encourage Christians to think about. I would think, of all people, Christians should be the most environmentally friendly, sensitive, because if you really believe God made this world, then there's value in everything from a housefly to a giant sequoia. And we shouldn't just wantonly, willingly kill stuff just because it's annoying us or putting us out or an inconvenience. I mean, could you imagine if you applied that to other things in your life? And so, to me, it's an act of respect as I love and care for God's creation. And I'm not confused. I don't confuse the creation with God. I'm not a pantheist. I believe there's a God and a creation. But I believe that creation is important to God, and that's part of how I show my love and respect to him, is how I care for it. Lion King is an interesting movie, and you can use these for your application projects. Those are worth 50 points. And make sure you look at the guidelines first, because I asked specific questions. The Lion King is kind of like a blend of animism, but see, a lot of it is like personification or anthropomorphism, where they're basically making the lions and warthogs and meerkats like little people, right? They're not acting like their animal selves who happen to be alive and have a spirit, but they've given them human qualities. But really, The Lion King is much more of a pantheistic movie. All is one, all is God. we're all part of the cycle of life of one thing. Now, animists can also believe in the cycle of life. For example, the grass grows, the deer eats the grass, we hunt the deer, eat the deer, we die, we go back into the earth, grass grows from our decomposing body. And so we have that circle of life in that sense of animism. But the spirits are separate: the grass spirit, the deer spirit, the human spirit, the earth spirit. Where in pantheism, there really is only one spirit, one thing, and that is God. And you can call it God or nature, it doesn't really matter, but there is only one thing. One more example, counterexample, Beauty and the Beast. Is that an animistic movie? Trick question.
No, because they were cursed, and it's like witchcraft and magic and stuff.
So good, Ryan, thank you. Right, it's not like the candelabra had a solar spirit in and of itself. It was a human that got turned into a candelabra or put into a candelabra. So the Beauty and the Beast is actually a cult and witchcraft. It's not animism. Now, there is some witchcraft shamanism in Pocahontas, like in the opening scene. The medicine man is trying to ward off the spirits of the dead. Because at the end of last lecture, I think I mentioned the dead enemies are much more dangerous than living enemies because they can attack you even in your dreams. And I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about the dead today and how different animistic cultures relate to the dead. But before I do that, and one of the books I used previously in this class, it's called The Ways of Religion. And I like this book because it gives you like a sampler from different religious traditions. But just like in Christianity, where we have from very liberal, progressive, mainstream denominations to very orthodox, conservative, fundamentalist, other religions have that as too. Buddhism, Islam, Hinduism. And so I love getting a spectrum from a religious perspective. It's interesting because this book has a lot of different type of Christians, but none that people from our school or our particular sect of Christianity would align with. And I think that's interesting. And I didn't realize what a fringe group I was a part of until I became a member of the Evangelical Philosophic Society and then later the American Academy of Religion. And because I grew up in like evangelical fundamentalism, I just assumed that was the norm. But as I got out and started interacting with other Christians from America and around the world, I realized not only was I a fringe on the spectrum of Christianity, like way over here, but we were quite small compared to a lot of these other denominations. And I just think that's very interesting. But one of the articles in here, it's called Errors of Terminology. And I just think it's helpful in talking about world religions. Let's see if I can find this real quick. I might need to go get my glasses. 425. And this article was written by an African scholar, and I'll try not to butcher his name, but I never heard it pronounced, so I'm not quite sure. Ibolaji Idawu. And he came from Africa, actually studied at Oxford University, so you know this guy has to be bright and gifted. And while he was studying in England, he was quite shocked how Western Europeans talked about indigenous or tribal sorts of religions and cultures, and he found it quite offensive. And so I just want you to be aware, when you're engaging with people from other religions, be careful of what you're saying, because you may not mean anything offensive by the terms, but he has, like, we would call them trigger words now. He has like these 5 trigger words that if you use them when talking about religion with him, there's going to be some pushback. And so the first one out of the chute is savage. And even in my lifetime, I have heard people in my church pray for the savages in other countries. Like they're going to go on a mission church and they're just like, could we just bow and pray God's blessing as we go to try to bring the gospel to the savages? Well, obviously that's not a very flattering term to the people you're going to visit and share the good news with. Because savage, if you look at it in a cultural anthropology terminology, it is the lowest rung of humanity, just above the beast. So you go like the primates, the beast, into savagery, then you move into barbarism, and then into a civilized society. So we're not even praying for barbarians. We're praying for these humans that are just above the beast when we call them savages. And so there's really no need to be calling people savages, at least, unless they are, right? But that's probably not what we're talking about when we're talking about indigenous people. The next word is native. And you might think, well, what's so offensive about native? I mean, people put bumper stickers on their car in California saying native since 1952 or 1978, and you could take pride in being native. I've seen Baptist churches called native or primitive Baptist churches, but they mean something different by that, right? They mean like untainted, original, not added onto. But when we say the word native, it often implies backwards, uneducated, uncivilized. And so this guy was actually at a bed and breakfast, and they were playing some cards, and it was his turn to shuffle, and he was a good shuffler, and one of the English women said, "Oh my, can all natives from your country shuffle cards like that?" Or, no, she said, "Can all natives shuffle cards like that?" And he said, "Natives of where?" Because he realized it had never occurred to her that she was a native of England, right? But that's not how she was using the word native. She was using it as you uneducated, poor, backwards, uncivilized people. So that could be very aggressive. I mean, what we would call like a microaggression in our society, right? The next is the word, I think I mentioned primitive already. And primitive, it can mean original, but it usually means ignorant, backwards, uneducated as well. So we probably shouldn't be calling people primitives. His last two words are very similar, and they are paganism, or pagan, and heathen. And what's funny is, I've actually heard pagan and heathen quite a bit in my evangelical conservative circles, but it's usually Christians calling other Christians pagans or heathens. They're not calling the pagans or heathens pagans and heathens. They're calling other Christians pagans and heathens. What's interesting to me is I love etymology, the origins of words. So pagan literally means country dweller. And you might be like, well, how does that come to be synonymous with non-Christian? It's because when Christianity became the state religion in the 4th century in Rome, it was the urban metropolitan areas that converted. But the people in the country, the pagans, the country dwellers, kept to the old ways, the pre-Christian European religions. And so pagan became associated or synonymous with non-Christian. And then later, heathen, that literally means dwellers of the heath, people that live in the fringe. These are the people that live in East County and beyond. Those are the heathen, that they live beyond the civilized. And once again, like the country dwellers, they kept to the old ways, and Christianity came much later to them. So just keep that in mind while we're doing the course. Be careful of your words. If you're doing interviews, you might want to run it by me first, and use some common sense. Would you want someone to ask you those questions? And how comfortable would you be answering the questions you're asking other people? That's a good way to kind of check yourself. Any questions on that before we get into the dead? Okay. I mentioned last class the importance of the dead in a lot of animistic religions. And the idea here is the dead, even though they may be separated from their physical vehicle, they are still alive. And in one African tradition, and I think this is common through many tribal groups, but remember, each tribal group could have like a little different take. They're like a different culture, a little different skew on this concept. But this one I want to talk about, there's categories, and I believe there's 4. So we have the living, the living dead, the spirit realm, and then deity or deities, depending if it's a monotheistic or polytheistic culture. So the living are like all of us here in this Zoom chat. Our spirit is still connected to our body. We're bound to this physical material plane, even though we have a non-material spirit, soul spirit inside of us. When we die, we go into the living dead realm. And this living dead realm lasts as long as there is a living person that remembers you. If you guys saw that movie Coco, the animated about Mexican Dia de los Muertos, Day of the Dead, it has a very similar concept. As long as the dead relative was remembered, you make their favorite meal on the Day of the Dead, you keep their picture, you have maybe like a little shrine to them. As long as they are in memory of a living person, they stay in the realm of the living dead. Now, the living dead can be helpful or harmful. They can aid you, they can give you advice, they can protect you from evil, and they can be like an intermediary between the living and the spirit world. So if you need healing, if you need to find a lost object, you might pray to your dead auntie or talk to your departed grandma, or if you need advice about hunting or fishing, you might try to tap into your dead uncle or dead father's wisdom. And we see this in like Japanese and Chinese culture. In Shinto, this idea of ancestor worship of the dead, having shrines. If you saw the movie Mulan, even though it's a Chinese character, that's very similar to ancestor worship we see in Japan as well. And those ancestors can either aid you if you're following in the family and honoring the family, or they can thwart you if you're just disgracing or disregarding the family honor and name. The Japanese, like the Mexicans have their Day of the Dead, where they celebrate those who have passed. The Japanese have what's called an Obon Festival. And the Obon Festival is where the community gets together and they dance as a community with the dead. And if you've never got an opportunity to do this, I would highly recommend it. I know the first one I went to, I was a little unsure because I didn't know if it was going to be demonic or spirits or whatever. But as I saw the ritualized dancing, and it's quite beautiful. So you have, like, if you know, like the kodo drummers, like that Japanese style drumming, and they've set the beat, and then you have the community dancing in like a circle around the drums, and it's very ritualized movements that the people are doing. And the idea is to invite the dead, people you have lost, especially in the last year, to come and dance with you. And so I used that time to meditate on friends and family that I had lost, and it was just a nice, from my perspective, it was a nice time of remembrance. I wasn't feeling or being aware of my dead grandparents or childhood friends or that sort of thing, but I love the sense that the dead are still with us. It's not like they have left. From my people, the Celts, who were in Europe before the Germanic tribes came in and the Romans, so now they're just kind of in the fringes, like in Scotland, Wales, Ireland, Brittany, places like that. They're still Celtic peoples. And this is from my people behind me, the Green Men. I think I mentioned that. But one of their high holidays was called Samhain. And it's spelled it's pronounced Samhain, but it's spelled like Samhain. My dyslexia kicked in. So Samhain, Samhein, was the Celtic Day of the Dead, and it took place on the Celtic New Year, or New Year's Eve, which was October 31st. Surprise, surprise. And so this is part of, I mentioned that term syncretism, where you take two diverse things. So part of the Roman Catholic missional ideology was, as long as you can bring the gospel into a culture, or Christianity into a culture, adapt as many of their own traditions as customs as you can, as long as they don't directly violate the gospel. And so you have a lot of syncretism going on with the religions of the Celts, of the Native Americans, of the Aztecs, of the Japanese, of the Chinese, as Christian missionaries, especially Catholic missionaries, would go into different countries. And so the Catholics name Samhain All Hallows Eve, and there they celebrated those who had died in Christ, and that is how they put like a Christian veneer over the top of that animistic high holiday, the Day of the Dead. And it wasn't just that holiday, right? I mean, we have a lot of Nordic Celtic infusions into our Western traditions. So, for example, Christmas, Christ Mass, the day we celebrate that is on December 25th. But December 25th was the Roman birthday of the sun in the sky, because that is the day in the year where the sun, it's reached the winter solstice on this 22nd, and for 3 days the sun appears to just be still. And then on the 25th, days begin to get longer again, and so it's called the birthday of the sun. And so they syncretized the celestial deity, of who Constantine was a worshiper. When he converted to Christianity, they use that same holiday to celebrate the birth of the Son of God. But Scripture doesn't tell us the day when Jesus was born. We can maybe infer the season based on shepherding and things like that, but we don't have a specific month or day for the birth of Christ, and so that's a syncretism. Another would be the celebration of Saturnalia, the god Saturn, and his devotees would go through the streets singing drunken carols to the god. They'd go naked, door to door, singing bawdy songs, and everyone have a good time. They would choose a king for the day. It was also called the fool for the day, because even though he got to do whatever he wanted and everyone had to obey him, at the end of the day he got sacrificed for the sins of the people, and then he would be consumed. And we still remember this through the making of gingerbread men. And it just, you're just thinking, good Lord, what is going on? What does a Christmas tree have to do with Jesus, right? Well, for the Celts, that was a symbol of eternal life. The evergreen tree, it never lost its leaves, even through the winter. And mistletoe, that was the sacred plant of the Druids. They would gather it by moonlight with silver sickles and silver basins, and they would use it in their rituals. And we've incorporated that into like almost a love, a kiss, bring yourselves together. What else with those? Easter, right? Easter comes from the goddess Ishtar, or Astarte, the fertility goddess. And so what do rabbits and eggs and fancy hats and gloves have to do with the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus? Well, absolutely nothing. They have to do with the fertility cults of spring, where people, and obviously eggs and rabbits are fertility symbols, where people would celebrate the newness of life, procreation, and you can imagine what those celebratory rituals were like. Let me give you one more example of syncretism. I don't even like to call it Easter because I think it's confusing. I prefer to call it Resurrection Sunday, and that's what the Eastern Orthodox call it, because they understand the pagan connections. So one Resurrection Sunday at my little church, the kids came out of Sunday school and they were so excited, and they were like, Uncle Fred, look what we did in Sunday school today. And I'm like, oh, good Lord, help me, show me. And you know those plastic eggs that you can then put smaller eggs inside, and smaller, almost like nesting dolls? Well, they had this big plastic Easter egg, and they opened the first egg, and inside is like a piece of a palm frond, and they said, this is a palm frond from Jesus's triumphal entry into Jerusalem. And then they open the next egg, and inside that is like a little piece of leather, and they were like, this is part of the whip with which Jesus was scourged. And then they open the next egg, and inside is like a piece of wood, and it's like, this is part of the cross that Jesus was nailed to. And then in the next one there's a nail, right? And in the next one there's a little piece of sponge from which Jesus was offered the the vinegar and wine, and then in the next one is a stone because he was buried and the stone was rolled in front of his grave. And then they're just so excited, almost beyond themselves, as they open the last egg. There's nothing inside because he is risen. He is risen indeed. And I'm just like, don't be that guy, Fred. Just be happy for the kids and that they're learning about Jesus. But holy syncretism, Batman. I mean, that's... I thought I did a lot of it, but that was a little over the top for me. And the problem, of course, is when people don't know where Christianity ends and paganism begins because they've been fused together into this process. And I'm not trying to tell you you can't have a Christmas tree or fairy lights or Yuletide logs, which were sympathetic magic to give strength back to the sun, but you can see how confusing it could be to people. And everyone has to navigate it. Some people navigate it by, no, we're only doing biblical holidays, like the holidays of the Jews, and we're not celebrating any of this pagan stuff. Because think about the Jewish holidays. Each day of the week is named after a day of creation. Our days of the week are named after pagan, Greco-Roman and Nordic and Celtic gods. So every day of the week we're speaking the names of pagan deities. That's how much it's influenced our culture. Even a lot of words in our vocabulary are the names of pagan gods. For example, the god that lived at the end of your property was called Terminus. The god of orchards was called Pomona. And we have all of these pagan things just wrapped right into our language, as well as the planets. All days of the week we see these pagan deities reflected. Where am I going with this? Oh, so my strategy has been with my kids, I tell them both. I tell them the Christian version, but then I want them to know these were the pre-Christian traditions that kind of got folded in and mixed and matched. But I want them to know this is the Christian one, this is the pagan one. I don't mind celebrating both simply as kind of like the traditions of our people and where we came from. I just don't want people to get confused with what is from Christ, what is from the scriptures, and what is from the traditions of our ancestors. And so that's how I do it. I'll never forget, if I told you the story already, I'm sorry, but my dad was a Baptist preacher, fundamentalist, and we always read the story of Jesus' birth out of Luke every year before we were allowed to open presents. And I guess he thought I was old enough. I was probably in my 40s, and he said, Fred, would you like to share the Christmas story this year? And I said, really? And he's like, yeah. And I said, which one? And he said, the true one. I said, okay. And so I launched onto this whole thing about Saturnalia and gingerbread men and the birthday of the sun, and my dad is just shaking his head, and that was the last time I ever got to do the Christmas story at our house. But I want the kids to know. I don't want them to get confused later when they find out Jesus was born on the same day as the sun in the sky. I mean, that would be disconcerting to me. So be aware. I don't think it needs to upset you, but I want people to be aware of it. And we still do the same things too, right? When we try to do ministry and reach out, we might have, we call it seeker-friendly churches, where we might have contemporary music, a contemporary message. We might have a little comedy show to loosen people up ahead of time. We might have a dinner afterwards. But we're using like American norms and techniques to try to facilitate the gospel. I'm not opposed to that. I'm just concerned if people confuse the church or the gospel with a business, a corporation, or a club, because that's not what it is. But when you use those elements, you could see how people could become confused. All right, moving on. I wanted to spend a little time, I got 5 minutes. I want to spend a little time talking. I talked about the Celts already, so I'll move on from then. I already talked about how the Catholic Church was able to turn the high god of the Celts, Cernunnos, the horned one, into our contemporary view of Satan. I mean, how brilliant is that? Because the Celts didn't have a Satan. They certainly had rough and tumble gods, but they didn't have the equivalent to a Lucifer or the devil in the Bible. I would love to do a whole class just on Native Americans and Native American religion and philosophy, but let me just give you a couple highlights that I found super interesting. One is the Inuit, people that live up in the Arctic Circle or above. They had this concept of an Innua, and so an Innua was a collective soul or a collective spirit. So they believe some animals, like humans, dogs, I don't know, maybe a polar bear, they had their own individual soul. But other things like mosquitoes, fish, seals, they shared an Innua, a collective seal spirit, or a collective mosquito spirit, or a collective salmon spirit. And so the idea was you need to be in good terms with that overarching collective soul spirit if you want to have positive interactions with the little minions that are under its influence. So when the Inuit would hunt seals, what they would do is they'd cut a hole in the ice, and when the seals would come up for air, they would harpoon it, and they would pull it out of the hole, and the first thing they would do after they had killed it is they would breathe air into the lungs of the seal, because that's what it had come up for. And then they would thank it for giving itself so that the Inuit could live and his family and his dogs and those sorts of things. They would leave the head pointing towards the east to the rising sun, and then they would use every part of the seal. They wouldn't, in a respectful way. And in doing so, it let the overarching seal Innua know this is a respectful hunter, he respects our people, and we will give ourselves to him when he is in need. Now, if another hunter went and he caught the seal and he pulled it out and he goes, "Oh, you stupid seal, you didn't see that one coming, and now I'm going to eat you." Well, that individual seal might not be able to do anything about it, but the seal Innua will say to the other seal people, do not give yourself to that hunter in the future. He disrespects us, he doesn't honor us, etc. Did I tell you my mosquito story in the woods about the mosquito Innua? Okay. When I worked on a trail crew in Yosemite, it was the worst mosquitoes I ever saw up at Vernon Lake. And around our campfire, we had cut these tree logs that we were using for seats, and we're all sitting around the fire, about 12 of us, and each of us had our own cloud of mosquitoes hovering over our heads. And this one guy on my trail crew, if you flex your arm sometimes when a mosquito is biting you, you can actually pin the proboscis into your arm. And so he caught the mosquito, and then he pulled it off by a wing, and he ripped off one wing and flicked it, and he ripped off the other wing and flicked it, and then he put the mosquito on another log, and he goes, "Bite me now." And I was looking at him going, "What is the matter with you? Aren't you afraid?" And he's like, "What's the mosquito going to do to me?" I'm like, "Not that mosquito. What about the mosquito Innua?" And he goes, "What's the mosquito Innua?" And I kid you not, at that moment, every swarm from all 11 other people went to that guy, and he went off screaming into the woods, and we didn't find him for a couple days, and it wasn't pretty. So Innuas, that's this idea of a collective soul. And I'm out of time. I'm going to talk just a little bit maybe about The Spirit of the Rainforest. It's a book we have in our library. It is a rough book, though. I'm not necessarily recommending it because I've painted kind of more or less maybe a positive view of animism. Maybe not. I don't know how you feel. But this is a very dark view, and the very negative things that come with it. The fear, the superstition, having to placate spirits, and then using them for nefarious purposes. And so I want to share that with you a little bit, so I'm not just making it all Pocahontas animism for you, which is a very romantic type of animism that would drive my missionary students crazy. But we'll talk about Spirit of the Rainforest next class, and then I'm going to ask you to answer that question. Can you be a Christian animist, or are those mutually exclusive propositions? And so, until next time.